This is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will take a look at the final two speeches in a debate round. These are the two speeches in policy debate. It's the second negative rebuttal and second affirmative rebuttal that are taking a look back at everything that happened in the debate round and putting them all into perspective for the judge. In my opinion, I think these are the two most important speeches in terms of winning the debate round. One of the things that I said in a previous presentation was that I think that the first couple speeches, you usually don't win or lose the round. You're building the foundations for arguments. So unless you make a huge strategic error in constructing your case, you're not really going to have too many problems. You're just setting up the debate so you can progress forward. And in the middle of the debate, again, you're not really winning the debate, you're developing the debate. You're adding depth, you're adding understanding, you're engaging in clash. And again, you might lose a debate by making some critical errors, but you're typically not winning the debate until the final two speeches in the debate. Because those are the speeches where you're looking back and you're examining the efforts of both teams, putting those efforts into perspective, putting the issues and the arguments into perspective in such a way that the judge sees why you should win the debate. And so what this presentation will do is look at the way that the ways that I think that you can put together effective rebuttal speeches. There are three primary methods. Actually, that's not even true. There are three methods for putting together the 2NR and the 2AR in a policy debate round. The vast majority of debaters will use the traditional approach. In fact, I would probably say it's near 100%. But I have also found that there are two other ways that you can construct or present the second negative rebuttal and the second affirmative rebuttal in order to win that ballot. Primarily, I get these ideas from my time coaching in British parliamentary debate or the world-style debating format. I found that these additional two methods, the primary questions or the whip speech and the balancing approach, are very effective when debating in front of parents as judges. So when you have a lay judge or maybe you have a teacher from the school who's judging the round, I think that those two methods can be very, very effective for you. So let's look at the first one, the traditional approach or the traditional way of crystallizing the debate, retrospectively evaluating the debate. Like I said before, that method is used 99.999% of the time in debate rounds. And it is very heavily focused on the line by line in terms of time allocation. The vast majority of the speech will be spent on that linear development of the arguments, just as the first negative constructive, the second affirmative constructive, and so forth were. The difference is you will also make time during that final rebuttal speech to identify the voting issues or identify the critical issues in the debate. And although you might be spending the most time on the line by line, it's that identification of the critical issues which ultimately wins the debate for you. So it's actually probably the most important part of your speech, even though time-wise it's a smaller portion of the speech. There are three places that debaters will typically place these voters or identify these critical issues and explain how you win the debate. You can embed those critical issues in the speech. So as you're traveling through the line by line, you're going to talk about the affirmative harm story, you're going to talk about the affirmative solvency story, you might have a disadvantage and a counterplan in the round, for example. On each of those issues, as you go through the line by line, when you finish up the debate on that particular issue, you would explain why that issue matters to the judge. The second method is to essentially write the reason for decision for the judge as the very first thing you say in your final rebuttal speech. So you carve out some time in your speech where you are essentially explaining to the judge what the round looks like, how the issues play out in favor of you if you're the negative, or play out in favor of you if you're the affirmative. And so you do that first, and then let the line by line provide the context for that reason for decision. And the third way that you can do it is to write the reason for decision as the last thing you say in your speech. So you begin with the line-by-line debate, and then after you have finished that, you finish up with a final summation of the round explaining what transpired and why you win. Now, you'll notice that I have different text on here. I have embed the critical issues in italics. I actually think that that's probably the weakest form of the traditional approach. I think it's too easy for the judges to lose sight of what really matters when you are just doing it in the middle of the debate. It works out much better for you if you explain the critical issues as the first or last thing that the judge hears from your speech. But I do in fact put write the reason for decision last, excuse me, in bold, and I underline it. Because I think that that is actually the most effective method of convincing the judge to vote for you, or the most effective way of providing that traditional crystallization of the round. Excuse me. I think that that's the strongest method because it's the very last thing that the judge hears from you, which tends to stick with the judge. It tends to stick with the judge. In fact, if you're the second affirmative rebuttalist, if you're the very last speaker in the round, that can be an incredibly powerful tool to spend the last minute or so of your speech really explaining the round for the judge. And if you do your job really well, the judge may actually write that down almost verbatim on the ballot. As a judge, I love that when a debater does it for me. Now, a lot of coaches and a lot of debaters will actually choose the middle approach, write the reason for decision first. Primarily, they do that because of concerns about time management. It takes a lot of discipline as a debater to ensure that you save the time at the end of your speech to actually provide that reason for decision, to provide that summary of the debate. And if you get bogged down in the line by line, then you never leave yourself enough time to do what the most important part of your speech is. So you need to be disciplined if you're going to write the reason for decision last. In fact, as a debater, when I was in college around my sophomore year and even the beginning of my junior year, I would actually set my timer for less time than my speech actually was. And that encouraged me to get through the line by line to ensure that I saved enough time for that final summation. So, what does it look like? In that reason for decision, or in that final summation, you are comparing the winning arguments in the debate. And to be truly effective, you actually need to identify the critical arguments or the winning arguments from both teams. You want to identify both the negative and the affirmative team's winning issues. You don't want to ignore the other side. Probably a common reaction for debaters is to want to ignore that piece of the debate which can win the round for your opponents. The problem with doing that, though, is that then your opponents get to control the narrative on that issue. You want to engage that. You want to give credit to your opponents for their critical arguments, but you want to show the judge why that argument doesn't beat your arguments, either because you've beaten that argument or because your arguments are simply more important. You also want to compare the end game of the round, and that goes back to the impact calculus discussion that I gave in a previous presentation. You can explore the magnitude of the impacts, both quantitatively and qualitatively. You can explore the likelihood or the probability of those impacts occurring, as well as the probability of being able to solve those impacts. You can talk about the time frame of the impacts in the round. Which ones are occurring first? Are some decades away and are some immediate? Which ones happen first? And then also irreversibility. Can we correct the problem later on some of these impacts? Can we fix it later? And if so, maybe that's a part of our decision making. And if you have the ability to, use even if comparisons. Use language that helps the judge see that even if we lose this part of the debate, even if we lose this, we're still going to win because of this, right? If you can use those sorts of comparisons in the round, it can be really persuasive to the judge. So, what does it look like in practice? If you're doing the reason for decision last, you would simply start off with an incredibly short introduction, 5 to 15 seconds in length, that says something along the lines of, we win 3 reasons, and then identify the 3 critical issues in the debate. If you're on the negative, that might be we win 3 reasons. 1, the case is unlikely to solve. 2nd, the trade-off disadvantage. That's it. And then you move into the line-by-line analysis. And like I said, that takes up the vast majority of your speech time, about 4 minutes, maybe even a little longer than 4 minutes. And then you save 45 to 60 seconds at the end of the round to really explain everything in the debate. Now, you do want to include some internal summaries on all of the individual issues as you finish the line by line. So when you finish talking about, say, the social services trade-off disadvantage, or the proliferation disadvantage, or whatever it is, you want to spend a few seconds summarizing just that argument and why you win it, or why your opponents don't win it. And that will help your ability to tell a convincing story later on in the debate round. To some extent, that's almost like embedding the voters, even though you're still saving 45 to 60 seconds at the end of the debate round to summarize everything. So why does it work? Well, quite simply, it is the expectation of almost every judge who you will encounter, whether they are trained in the traditional roles of the speakers. They're a coach who's been around for a while. They're a lay judge who judges at one tournament a year, or they've been trained by a coach. Or if you're on the national circuit and you're debating in front of college coaches, high school coaches, former debaters, this traditional method is what they expect. And speaking to the expectations of your judge is pretty important if you want to actually win the debate round. It's also effective because it's really clear. It's really direct. It spells things out for the judge. It tells them exactly what happened in the round, exactly what issues matter in the round. So providing that sense of clarity can be really effective to communicate with the judge, and it also minimizes judge intervention. They're a lot less likely to consider other extraneous information if you're providing that very clear reason for decision at the end of the debate or at the end of your speech. When does it fail? Well, there are two main times that this method fails. One is if you have undisciplined time management. So if you're doing the reason for decision as the last thing that you say and you want to save 45 to 60 seconds for that, if you get bogged down in the line by line and you get to the reason for decision with only 10 seconds remaining, or even no seconds remaining, then it's really difficult to win the judge's ballot using that method. You might still eke out the win, luck into it, so to speak, but you're going to be far less effective. Similarly, if you do the reason for decision first and you spend too much time telling that story, then you might not leave enough time for the line by line, which you have to win in order for your story to make sense. And if you're embedding the voters, again, you can get bogged down in the line by line and never actually make it to the end. So that can be a problem for debaters using the traditional method. Ultimately, though, I think that the rewards of putting that reason for decision as the last thing out of your mouth in your speech is so strategically beneficial that that's what you should strive to do. There is also a problem sometimes with a judge's ego. Some judges don't want to be told how to vote. They don't want you saying things like, "We win 3 reasons," or "You vote for me because." They feel like they're in the place to adjudicate that. They're the one who is supposed to be making that decision. Who do you think you are to be telling me how to evaluate this round? Sometimes that happens with educators who are judging the round. Sometimes it happens with lay judges. And sometimes it happens with college debaters who are trained in a different format, such as British Parliamentary debate, where the students or the competitors don't really communicate that directly to the judges. And so sometimes it can actually harm you to use this approach with some of those judges. So just be aware of that, be cognizant of that fact, and make sure that whoever your judge is, that maybe you tweak your language, you tailor your language to appeal to that individual or not set them aside. Okay, the second method for giving a summary speech is actually the way that the final rebuttalist speakers, quote unquote, in a British parliamentary debate round would present their speeches. It's called a whip speech in British parliamentary debate, and although it's not traditionally found in policy debate, I have found with my students that you can actually use this form of a rebuttal speech quite effectively with lay judges, whether it be a teacher who's coming to the tournament or a parent. What you do with this method is you identify the 2 to 3 main points of clash in the debate. or the primary issues that have been presented in the debate. You identify what those are and create the entire speech or a significant portion of the speech around those three primary issues. And you phrase those issues as questions for the judge. Now, it is also critically important that you encapsulate the arguments of both sides within those 2 to 3 questions. You don't want to focus solely on your arguments. You want to incorporate your opponent's arguments, because you want to be able to show how the debate actually occurred and how the issues compare to one another. So, for example, a couple years ago, the high school policy debate topic was resolved the United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in transportation infrastructure, or increase transportation infrastructure investment in the United States. One of the potential plans, one of the many plans on that debate topic, was port security. So we bring in cargo containers into American ports. So we're shipping goods all across the world, and goods are coming into the United States. And one of the plans was to beef up port security. And one of the primary justifications for that case was related to the potential of terrorists to come in through those container ships, or to smuggle in weapons, weapons of mass destruction or whatever. And so that was one of the potential plans that was out there. A debate, obviously, around those issues might come up around whether or not there's actually a risk of terrorists coming in through our ports, whether or not we could actually have an effective method of improving security in our ports, and then of course there's any number of disadvantages which might be run by your opponents. And so you could envision a debate in which 3 primary questions have come up over the course of the first 6 speeches. 1, is there a legitimate maritime terrorist threat? Are we at risk? 2nd, can we significantly reduce that threat? So that's encapsulating, in the first question, the debate around the harm story presented by the affirmative. The second question brings up the issues of solvency, whether or not the plan will be effective. And third, you would have a question maybe about how can the government best fulfill its duty to save lives. Now, implied in that question is the idea that both the affirmative and the negative are defaulting to a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. But it's in this question that you would compare the solvency of the affirmative against the disadvantages which your opponents have run. Most likely, if you're collapsing down to these 3 questions, your opponents have only gone for one disadvantage in the 2NR. And so that would be a very clear encapsulation of the debate, potentially. On each of those questions, as you evaluate the arguments on both sides of those questions, you will want to incorporate internal summaries to show how your side actually wins the clash on each of those questions. Doing so will help to ensure that you actually pick up the judge's ballot. So how much time in the 2NR or 2AR do you devote to developing those 3 questions? Well, there's 2 schools of thought on this. If you truly want to take the approach of a British parliamentary debater, you would actually devote the entire 2NR and 2AR to this method. So spend the entire 5 minutes summarizing the debate through those 3 questions, or 2 questions. That is very effective, I think, if you've got a lay judge, or if you happen to have a collegiate debater who was trained in British parliamentary debate. Using that method, you can actually use up the entire speech time. Because of the nature of analyzing the debate in that way, even if you're going to spend some time on the line by line, I would still say that you need to spend probably 1 to 2 minutes of your rebuttal developing the 3 questions. So if you have maybe a more traditional judge, maybe you have a coach at the back of the room, and you want to try this method, you might spend 3 minutes of the debate addressing the line by line, and then spend 2 minutes developing the 3 questions so that you don't ignore the line by line for that judge. Why does this method work? Well, there's 2 primary reasons why it is an effective way to develop the final rebuttal. 1, it's somewhat predictable. You can have a pretty good idea before the tournament even begins what questions are going to come up, specifically if you're on the affirmative. You can think ahead about what those primary summary questions are going to be and plan accordingly. Develop your rhetoric to ensure that you have a powerful case or a powerful closing argument. It also is effective because it demonstrates holistic debating. It shows the big picture. It shows the judge that you are thinking about all of the issues in a broader context and that you're not getting bogged down in the line by line and the nitty-gritty and ignoring the big picture, right? It's also effective because it demonstrates that you are recognizing the validity in your opponent's arguments at times, that you're willing to recognize that they've brought something important to the table as well. And that can give you a good ethos bump, both because you've seen the big picture and because you're giving some credit to your opponents. Now, why does it fail? Well, it can be an ineffective method if you fail to adapt to the round that occurred. On the previous slide, I mentioned that it can be effective because it's predictable, but that's a double-edged sword. If you start planning too much in advance, then you start to lose sight, or you run the risk of remaining flexible and addressing the actual debate that occurred. And instead, you may have developed a summary around a debate that you wanted to occur. And so that can be a problem. So you need to recognize that you must be flexible and you must actually summarize the round that occurred. It can also fail because it's an atypical rebuttal strategy. It's not what the vast majority of judges are used to, and that can come back to haunt you. Primarily, the way that it hurts you is because it gives the appearance that you're ignoring the line by line. You're ignoring the specific clash that occurred in the debate. And so, if you have a judge who's very, very concerned with the line by line, then this could be a bad method for summarizing the debate. However, if during the course of answering those questions, you are specifically pointing back to statements made by opponents, and you clearly signpost where those statements or where those responses or where those arguments occurred on the flow, then the judge can see that you are in fact answering the line-by-line issues. It can also be damaging to you if you miss a critical argument. One of the quirks of policy debate, I guess, is that we oftentimes can decide rounds by minor points. Someone labeled a specific issue a voting issue, or maybe they embedded a reverse voting issue on a topicality argument. In the big picture of exploring the debate topic, that might not be all that enlightening for us, but it can be a critical argument for evaluating that specific debate because of the impact on education or fairness of the activity. And with these big question strategies, you may miss those individual voters, those critical arguments which your opponents might use, or critical responses which your opponents might use to beat you. And so what I would say is that even if you're using this 3 questions method or the whip speech method, that you might take a little time at the beginning of your speech to deal with any of those hidden arguments that need to be answered, and then you can move into the 3 questions. And then the third strategy is the balancing strategy. This also comes from the world of British parliamentary debate, but I think that it can also be very effective incorporating it into the final summary speeches in a policy debate round. Or if you participate in Lincoln Douglas debate, public forum, it can be effective as well. Same with the previous strategy of the whip speech. But with this strategy, you are balancing the issues at play in the round, and it takes place in 3 ways. First, you need to identify all of the different people or creatures that are affected by the policy or the issues at play. Identify who is being affected, whether that's nature, whether that's people in poverty, whether it's all people in the world. You identify who is affected. And then you identify their needs, their wants, their desires. And then finally, you identify the effects on those individuals. on those stakeholders in the game. How much time do you devote to this strategy? Similar to the previous one, I would say that you could spend the entire 5-minute rebuttal developing the balancing strategy for your summary speech. Or if you have a judge who you think is going to really require you to have a lot of line by line, then you might spend 3 minutes on the line by line and save 2 minutes for the balancing strategy. But with a parent judge or a teacher judge, or a competitor or a college debater who's trained in British parliamentary debate, then of course you could use this balancing strategy for the entire 5 minutes. To actually pull it off, the first thing that you would do in your speech is discuss the government's role in balancing rights and interests of the people that it's responsible for. So in essence, you talk about the nature of government, and you probably could do that. That's going to sound relatively similar in just about every debate round that you use this strategy, and you can probably do that in 30 to 45 seconds. Second, you identify the key stakeholders in the conflict. Discuss each of those stakeholders' interests, recognize that all of those interests are legitimate, and then show how those interests are imbalanced. Either they're imbalanced in the status quo, or they're imbalanced by the affirmative proposal. So you show how the other team's advocacy creates an imbalance or allows an imbalance in the world. And that's going to take probably about half the time of what you have remaining after you've finished that first piece of discussing the government's role. And then finally, you want to show how your side best provides for balance, how you lead for the best possible outcome between affirmative worldview and negative worldview. And again, that would take about half of the time that you have remaining after you finish that discuss the government's role in balancing rights and interests. How much time? I already said that. It could be the entire 5 minutes. That would actually be preferred. But if you have a judge who's more traditional and expecting line by line, then maybe do 3 minutes on the line by line and a couple minutes on the balancing strategy. Why does it work? Well, rarely are controversies cut and dry. Rarely are our values black and white. It is unlikely that there is a clear-cut, yes, this is the correct side of the debate topic. In fact, it probably wouldn't be a debate topic if we were all in agreement on it. And so when you use the balancing strategy, you are recognizing that there are legitimate arguments and there are legitimate interests on both sides of the debate. And that can do a couple things for you. One, it gives you an ethos bump with many judges who will credit you for recognizing the validity in your opponent's argument. But I think that it also helps your persuasive storytelling when, rather than trying to ignore or play down the interests of the other side or the arguments of your opponents, that you actually recognize their legitimacy. Give them credit where credit is due, but then show why your side actually wins. Similar to the whip strategy, it's also predictable. You can have a pretty good idea of what your opponents are going to run against your affirmative case or why your case is a good idea. You know what your negative strategy is likely to be, your generic negative strategy is likely to be. So you can think in advance about how you would craft this balancing strategy. And again, it shows holistic debating for the judge. It shows that you're thinking about the big picture, the broader picture, and why we're even concerned with this debate topic to begin with. And then why does it fail? For the exact same reasons that I presented on the whip strategy. A failure to adapt, a potential failure to adapt to the specific debate that actually occurred. It's an atypical rebuttal strategy that traditional judges and college debaters are not going to be expecting, and they might think that you have failed to meet your burdens, primarily because it appears that you're ignoring the line by line. But like I said on the whip speech, you can show that you're concerned with the line by line as you work your way through the interests and how the sides are affected by the policies. You can reference the critical aspects of the line by line as you develop that story. And then, like I said on the previous slide, or on the previous method, you could end up missing a critical argument like a reverse voting issue or something that's labeled a voting issue. And so you want to make sure that you don't skip over those arguments because that would come back to haunt you. That's it. There are 3 primary methods or effective methods as I see it to presenting your final rebuttal in a debate round. You have the traditional method, which 99.999% of your judges are going to expect, where you have a heavy dose of line by line, but then you write the reason for decision for your judges. Alternatively, you can take some lessons from the world of British parliamentary debating or world-style debating and use the 3 questions methods of the whip speaker to look at the primary points of contention, phrase those points of contention as questions, and then explore who wins or which side wins each of those questions, presumably you. And then third, the balancing strategy, talking about the nature of government, the role that the government plays, and how it has a responsibility to look out for the interests of multiple parties, not just a single party, recognize the interests of those stakeholders, show how there's an imbalance created by your opponent's advocacy, and how your side best promotes balance or best preserves balance or leads to the best possible outcomes for the different stakeholders in the debate.